The words came not in a grand setting, but in the quiet of our suburban kitchen, where the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound competing with my husband's voice. I've been offered a position in London, and I'm taking it, alone. Richard, my husband of 25 years, stood by the counter, his coffee untouched, his eyes avoiding mine. The announcement wasn't shouted. It was delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had already made up his mind. Our son, Ethan, was upstairs, likely still asleep, unaware that his father was dismantling our family with surgical precision. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm 52, and until that moment, I had been the anchor of our household. I'd stepped away from my career as a landscape architect to manage the chaos of raising Ethan, supporting Richard through his rise in the corporate world, and keeping our lives in order. I'd planned every holiday, mediated every argument, and balanced the checkbook when Richard's ambitions outstripped our budget. For 25 years, I'd been the one who made sure the bills were paid, the house was a home, and Ethan's world was stable. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I nodded, my hands steady as I folded a dish towel. "When do you leave?" I asked, my voice as even as his. "2 weeks," he replied, finally meeting my gaze. There was no apology in his eyes, only a flicker of relief, as if he'd expected a fight and was grateful I hadn't given him one. From the corner of my vision, I saw the stack of mail on the counter bills, a college acceptance letter for Ethan, and a postcard from Richard's colleague, Sophie, who had joined his firm last year. Sophie, with her sharp wit and sharper ambition, who had started traveling with Richard on his business trips. I'd met her at a company gala, where she'd laughed too easily at his jokes and lingered too long by his side. I wasn't naive, but I trusted Richard, or perhaps I trusted the life we'd built too much to question it. I reached into the drawer, where I kept important documents, and pulled out a manila folder. I slid it across the counter toward him. "You'll want to read this before you go," I said, my tone neutral. Richard's brow furrowed. "What's this? Something for later," I replied, turning to pour myself a cup of coffee. "Ethan's upstairs. You should tell him yourself. He deserves to hear it from you." I left the kitchen, my footsteps silent on the hardwood floor, and walked out to the backyard. The garden I'd designed years ago before I traded my drafting table for PTA meetings was in full bloom. Roses climbed the trellis, and the lavender I'd planted for calm scented the air. I sat on the stone bench, letting the morning sun warm my face. For the first time in years, I felt a weight lift, not because Richard was leaving, but because I'd been preparing for this moment without even realizing it. 3 months earlier, I'd noticed changes. Richard's late nights, his sudden interest in weekend work retreats, the way his phone was always face down. Then there were the credit card statements, charges for dinners in cities he hadn't mentioned, a hotel room booked when he was supposedly at a conference. I'd spent 15 years as a landscape architect, designing spaces that told stories through structure and beauty. I knew how to read patterns, to see what wasn't said. So I started digging. I accessed our accounts, traced the charges, and found emails Richard hadn't bothered to delete. Messages to Sophie about their future, about how he'd break the news after Ethan's college decisions came in. They planned to start fresh in London, where Sophie had connections that could elevate Richard's career. He'd been siphoning money into a separate account, small amounts at first, then larger ones, assuming I wouldn't notice. But I'd always been the one who managed our finances, who balanced ambition with reality. I didn't confront him. Instead, I consulted a lawyer, a sharp woman named Clara, who specialized in high-asset divorces. She reviewed our marriage contract, a document we'd signed when Richard was still climbing the corporate ladder, and I was the one with a trust fund from my parents. The contract included a clause about financial transparency and fidelity terms Richard had agreed to without much thought. Assuming they'd never be tested, Clara helped me gather evidence. Bank statements, emails, even hotel receipts I'd found in his briefcase. I filed for divorce quietly, timing the service for the day after Ethan's college acceptance celebration, knowing Richard would wait until then to avoid disrupting our son's moment. Back in the garden, I heard the back door open. Ethan's voice, groggy but sharp, cut through the air. "Dad, what the hell are you talking about?" I stayed where I was, giving them space. Ethan was 18, old enough to handle the truth, but young enough to feel the sting. I'd shielded him from the details, wanting his senior year to be about his achievements, not his father's betrayal. When Ethan found me in the garden, his face was pale, his graduation cap still sitting on the kitchen table where he'd left it after last night's celebration. "He's leaving us, just like that?" he asked, his voice cracking. I stood and hugged him, feeling his shoulders tense. "He's leaving me," I corrected gently. "You and we're still a team. This doesn't change that." Ethan pulled back, his eyes searching mine. "You're too calm." "Did you know?" "I suspected," I admitted. "And I've made arrangements to protect us." He nodded, processing. "What was in that folder you gave him?" "A reality check," I said, managing a small smile. "Come on, let's get some breakfast." Inside, Richard was gone, the manila folder still on the counter, unopened. He'd left a note. "Eleanor, we'll talk when I'm back from London. I need time." I crumpled it and tossed it into the recycling. The folder contained the divorce papers, a detailed account of his financial maneuvers, and a copy of our marriage contract, highlighting the clauses he'd violated. I'd also included a letter from Clara, outlining the consequences, the freezing of our joint accounts, the claim to our home, and the demand for 60% of his assets due to the infidelity and financial deception clauses. Richard had always underestimated my attention to detail, assuming I'd remain the compliant wife who smoothed over his mistakes. He was about to learn otherwise. Over the next week, Richard called repeatedly, his tone shifting from defensive to desperate. "Eleanor, we can work this out," he pleaded in one voicemail. "I made a mistake. Sophie means nothing." I didn't respond. Clara handled all communication, ensuring every step was documented. Ethan, meanwhile, refused to speak to his father, focusing instead on preparing for college. He'd been accepted to Dartmouth, a dream he'd worked hard for, and I was determined to keep his focus there. I began reclaiming my life. The garden, long neglected, became my sanctuary again. I spent hours sketching new designs, reconnecting with the part of me that had once dreamed of creating beauty for others. I contacted old colleagues, pitching my services as a freelance landscape architect. My first project was a community garden for a local nonprofit, a small but meaningful step back into the world I'd left behind. 2 weeks after Richard's announcement, I received a call from Clara. "He's contesting the divorce terms," she said, her voice calm but amused. "Claims the contract is outdated and the infidelity clause doesn't apply because you knew and didn't object." I laughed, a sound that surprised even me. He thinks I consented by staying silent. Exactly, Clara replied. He's hired a lawyer, but it's a weak case. The evidence is airtight. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a month later. I used the time to solidify my plans. I sold a rental property we'd owned, a decision Richard had left to me years ago, and used the funds to start my own landscape design firm, Hayes Green Spaces. My first clients were women like me, starting over after life-altering changes. I designed gardens that symbolized renewal, winding paths, resilient perennials, spaces that invited healing. When the hearing arrived, Richard looked diminished, his confidence eroded by the reality of his situation. Sophie wasn't with him. I'd heard through mutual friends that she'd moved on when Richard's financial promises fell apart. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, reviewed the marriage contract and my evidence with meticulous care. "Mr. Hayes," she said, peering over her glasses, "your argument that the contract is invalid lacks merit. The clauses regarding fidelity and financial transparency are clear and were signed by both parties. The evidence of your actions, bank transfers, communications with a third party supports Mrs. Hayes's." Richard's lawyer stammered through a weak defense, but the judge was unmoved. "The joint accounts will remain frozen pending full discovery. The primary residence remains in Miss Hayes' possession, as stipulated. We'll reconvene in 60 days. As we left the courtroom, Richard approached me, his voice low. "Eleanor, this is vindictive. We built a life together. Doesn't that mean anything?" "It meant everything," I said, meeting his gaze. "Until you decided it didn't." I walked away, the click of my heels echoing in the marble hallway. For the first time in years, I felt like the architect of my own future. Over the next few months, my business grew. I hired an assistant and took on larger projects, including a public park redesign that earned local media attention. Ethan thrived at Dartmouth, calling me weekly to share his progress. He even started speaking to Richard again, though their relationship remained strained. The final divorce hearing was a formality. The judge upheld the marriage contract, awarding me the house, my trust fund, and 60% of our joint assets. Richard kept his personal account and his car, but his corporate ambitions in London faltered without the financial cushion he'd expected. Sophie was a distant memory, and Richard's social circle had shrunk as his colleagues distanced themselves from the scandal. 6 months later, I stood in the community garden I'd designed, watching families enjoy the space I'd created. A winding path led to a small fountain, surrounded by lavender and roses, symbols of peace and resilience. Ethan visited that weekend, walking the path with me. "You're different, Mum," he said, his voice warm. "Happier." "I'm me again," I replied, squeezing his hand. Or maybe for the first time, the folder I'd handed Richard that morning in the kitchen hadn't just been a legal maneuver. It was a declaration that I was done being the supporting character in someone else's story. In reclaiming my finances, my career, and my home, I'd reclaimed myself. The garden around me was proof. From careful planning and patient work, something beautiful could grow. Bold and beautiful, like my new business. Tucked into the video was a not-so-subtle nod to Richard's London adventure, with a clip of me tossing a suitcase-shaped planter into a compost pile, saying, "Sometimes you just have to let the rubbish rot." The video went viral, racking up thousands of views in days. Comments poured in from women and a few men, who'd been through similar betrayals, cheering my wit and resilience. "Eleanor, you're my hero," one wrote. "Planted a new rosebush in honor of kicking my ex to the curb," another added. I didn't name Richard explicitly classy, not cruel, but our small town knew. Oh, they knew. Richard called me, furious, after the video hit 0 views. "Eleanor, this is humiliating. You're making me a laughingstock." I sipped my tea, smiling. "Richard, you made your choices. I just turned mine into content. Maybe start your own channel. Call it How to Lose Everything in One Move." Ethan, now settled at Dartmouth, called me laughing after watching the video. "Mom, you're savage. Dad's never living this down." "Sweetie," I replied, "sometimes a little public pruning is the best revenge." 6 months later, my consultancy, Hayes Green Spaces, was thriving. I'd moved from a small office to a larger space downtown, hired 2 associates, and landed a contract to redesign a city park. My YouTube channel had grown to 20 subscribers, with weekly videos blending gardening tips, life advice, and the occasional jab at hypothetical exes who moved to London. I'd become a local celebrity of sorts, with women stopping me at the grocery store to say, "I saw your video. You inspired me to start my own business." The final divorce hearing was a formality. The judge upheld the marriage contract, awarding me the house, my trust fund, and 60% of our joint assets. Richard kept his personal account and his car, but his London dreams had crumbled. Sophie had moved on to a new corporate hotshot, and Richard was renting a 1-bedroom apartment, his social circle reduced to a few loyal co-workers who pitied him. As I left the courtroom, Richard approached me one last time. "Eleanor, I messed up. Is there any chance—" "No," I interrupted, my voice kind but firm. "But I wish you well. Maybe subscribe to my channel. You might learn something about growth." I walked away, my laughter echoing in the courthouse corridor. Back home, I filmed my next video, planting seeds for a new you, ending with a wink to the camera. If you like this, hit that like button, share with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to Eleanor's Green Revenge for more tips on thriving after pruning the dead weight. New video every Thursday.